explain to everybody, what did the founders mean when they said that all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence?
Well, they meant all people are created equal. In those days, that we just only recently stopped, saying men for humankind. So they meant all humans are created equal first. But to understand that, you have to understand the context in which it was said. At that time, what we had in the world was utter inequality everywhere. You traveled east or you traveled west, people were subjects to monarchs who were the state. So the whole system everywhere was based on the idea that there were some who were born to rule, tiny, one person, right, and his cohort, and everybody else was born to be ruled. That was just the way it was. It was accepted as the way of things. So when the founders came out and said, all people are created equal, what they were standing against with this worldwide system of kings and emperors and subjects. That's the context of that claim.
And also very significant that it's are created equal, right? We're talking about, again, I guess I'm repeating what you just said, but that it's at birth is what is the equality that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's right. So one guy born doesn't now become the future king, and one person born doesn't then become a subject for life, unable to even leave without permission. So that happens at birth. But they've got that word in there, created, and then just a few words later it says creator, to make the point clear. There's no question that for the founders, we're talking about the nature of things as a result of what kind of creatures we are, and what created us.
And how truly unique was it at the time? Were there other countries before us that had declared the same thing?
No, it was basically a contradiction in terms. I mean, people could look around the world and say, "Well, that's not true. There's not equality anywhere." It was such a radical idea that it was considered really by learned experts, the experts of their time. The people who tell us about global warming. Now what the experts in those days said, "Well, this whole system can't work. It'll fail." What happened instead was that all those courtiers were to watch as the regimes based on this strange idea of rulers and ruled collapsed around them. We don't have nowhere in any significance in this world do we have that system anymore, which was the system everywhere. I mean, Saudi Arabia's got a king and an official religion, but that's kind of a special place. Basically, kings and emperors are now ceremonial figures.
So America gets credit for basically putting an end to kingdoms.
We did it. And, late in his life, Jefferson said, everybody's eyes are opening to this truth that all people are created equal. That there's no such people that none are born to be ridden and none are born to ride. And so the founders, Jefferson said it beautifully, but the founders understood that they were about to turn the world right side up. They understood the teaching mission of the American idea. And not only has America been the most resplendently successful nation in the history of the world, it changed the system around the world simply by example.
Yeah, they were truly radicals at the time.
Truly radicals.
And I know you've written about that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really important to understand what a radical idea this was. This is the American regime is the most radical attempt to bring about human liberty in the history of mankind. It still is. It's completely based on the idea that we, the people, are capable of self-rule, which was just considered crazy at the time. Countries need kings and queens and emperors like the solar system needs the sun. That was the idea. And we showed that it was just a false belief.
Yeah, I think it is really important for people and to teach younger people how radical they were, because radicals today in America are arguing for the exact opposite.
Right.
And you're stodgy and mainstream to talk about the founders and the founding, when, as you point out, that is the radical nature. The radicals today are arguing against that radical notion.
Right.
They want to go. They want to go back in time.
Boy, that is good for you. That's exactly what they're doing. They are arguing for us to go back to a time when there's rulers and rule. Because because the American idea is like the ultimate in radicalism. Crazy idea. We can rule ourselves. Anything that goes away from that is these radicals have only one way to go, which is back to what we overcame: rulers and rule.
Yeah, here's a quote, I think, from one of your pieces. The creation of the U.S., it was the most radical attempt to establish a regime of liberty in the entire history of mankind. These men were brilliant, but also the opposite of traditional.
Yeah, they were overthrowing tradition everywhere. And thanks for reading that quote. I think you read it. I think I wrote it better than I said it just a minute ago.
So now let's talk about equality that we talk about today and compare it to what the founders had in mind. I mean, let's just start with, what would the founders' reaction be to these protesters that are in the streets and this radical movement today? What would they say about it?
Well, you said it best. It would be taking us in the wrong direction. Ruled by the mob. That's what the French didn't understand what was going on, and they had that crazy French Revolution, which was those mobs and people's heads on stakes, and a lot of people got guillotined. Remember that? And then that thing kind of fell apart, and then pretty soon they had Napoleon, who ruled as a military dictator, kind of on the model of Hitler, that kind of in many ways. And so what happened is, when you go for the mob rule, you go for killing off the eating the rich and all that sort of thing, what happens is, from history, what happens is breakdown of social order, and the clear risk even here is of someone taking over the way Napoleon did. That's the game. The American Revolution moved towards liberty for all, and also created a situation where we were able to become the most prosperous country in the world. The French Revolution, based on mistaken ideas of equality, resulted in chaos, murder, and finally tyranny.
And what was in what way were the French mistaken in their view of equality?
Perfect. The brilliance of the founders is no place more clear than the fact that they understood that equality only works if you have it together with unalienable rights. If you have the idea of equality, and you have the idea that you have your unalienable rights, I have mine, we all do, then the system can work. The French actually believed, I know it sounds crazy, but Rousseau actually said that what the system requires is that every person alienate their rights to the state completely, and that was their idea. So the idea was, we're going to have equality enforced by the state, and the means of it is we all alienate our rights to the state. That's what happened. It was crazy.
Would you compare it to the view of Black Lives Matter to pick one organization, or the progressive movement in America that seems to have this utopian view that the end result for everyone will be the same?
It's basically exactly right. Your question is so brilliant, because what we did is we had the one successful revolution in the history of the world, the American Revolution. What's happening now is an attempt to replace that revolution. Let's do this over, and let's do it the way the French did. Well, if we do it over the way the French did, it's pretty clear. We know how it turned out for France. There's no reason to believe it wouldn't turn out that way for us.
So here's a perfect example to use to talk about how equality is getting perverted. I don't know if you probably are aware of this, but in California right now, one person, Newsom, maybe a couple other people, because we also have people making independent decisions in each jurisdiction, whether it be a county health official telling you when you're allowed to go outside. But you also have Newsom creating these rules. And just when it looked like Los Angeles was close to meeting our COVID requirements of X% infected and below a certain number per day, the state came up with a new rule that said, well, it's not enough for the county's numbers to be below the thresholds. Each minority community within that county. Oh, yeah. This came out just a few days ago. This is why we're not going to open anything. Each minority community. Now, they identify which minority communities. It's African American, it's Latino, and it's Pacific Islander. Those are the three communities that, if there's pockets within your county, those communities must test also below those numbers, and everyone must wait for them to get their numbers down to where everybody else is. And that's this healthcare equality that you hear about. Health equity, I think, is the term. So what's wrong with health equity, meaning that everybody gets the same level of healthcare, right? If you're the founders, shouldn't you love that idea?
No, that's not their idea of equality at all. Their idea of equality is that, that we are not born to be ruled, and we can rule ourselves, and we will rule ourselves by this system that we've designed. Do you like it? Americans said yes. Or we get to pick our leaders in government who work as our agents. Well, Newsom is a tyrant, and these crazy things that he's doing are unbelievable. The founders wouldn't believe in doing it that way. The idea is all human beings are created equal. So this kind of equality is the one that says if there's more people in physics, if there are more men in physics than women, we have to fix that ratio, which is, everything has to be equal. But that's crazy, of course, because people have different interests and talents.
Well, to go out the dumb example, but the NBA needs to be fixed.
That's where I was going.
Right? There's far too many African Americans.
I'm sorry you call it a dumb example. That's exactly where I was going. I mean,
dumb because it's so obvious.
Yeah, it's not. Why is it that? Why is if that's so? If more men are physicists than women, why isn't it a problem that they're why isn't it a scandal?
Right. So there's really two problems, it seems to me, from the founders would have with this. Looking at these minority communities and the health in the minority communities. One is you're identifying groups based on their race,
right,
their ethnic background.
Right.
And number two, you're looking for health equality among all people when the founders were not concerned about that type of equality.
At all. The whole notion that Jeff Bezos has more money than you and I do, and that you're better looking than I am, is some kind of, with the equality. It's just nuts. It's not what they were thinking about. But there's a communist idea that says we have to take all the wealth in the middle of the street and everybody gets exactly the same slice. That's an idea that really it came as, not to get too complicated, but it came as part of a reaction to what America showed about how things could be. So the Marxist thing happened, almost a century later, it got going, and it was part of a reaction to the founders and not a fulfillment.
So, what's wrong with trying to make healthcare equal for every American?
It's not the idea of equality that the founders had. So that's one of the mix. So equality is being used as if it's from the Declaration. What is actually being used to promote is basically a communist idea.
Right. So let's just divorce ourselves from the founders for a second and just say,
what's wrong with it in general?
Yeah. What would the founders say if they were alive today to this idea that, hey, our push is to make healthcare equal for everyone? That should be an important objective, and the government should ensure that everyone in America gets equal healthcare.
It's one of I would say, if I have a single criticism of the founders, and I say that as someone who respects them so much, the more time I spend thinking about them and reading them, the more my respect grows. But then the mistake they made that was evident now, that never even occurred to them then, was that the American founders should emphasize freedom of religious care, freedom of health care, just like they emphasized freedom of religious conviction. I mean, that was like the biggest thing for the founders, really. That the big change they made was that there wasn't a state religion. There wasn't going to be a state religion. Certainly there was in every other country with a monarch. So here we're going to have religious freedom. And that was Madison's most ardent concern and belief. Founders were really big on all that. They just didn't see what was possible for Madison. And they should have, if they had known, and they didn't know, and so they're completely forgiven by everyone who thinks about it, they should have emphasized the need of freedom of health care. You happen to talk to somebody who is very skeptical of much that goes on in medicine, and extremely alarmed by the idea that we're all going to be straitjacketed into a certain level of government dispensed, rationed, and bureaucratic care, as like they have, for example, in England. Are you familiar with with the scandals of people laying in hospitals and gurneys, in halls and dying and stuff like that because the place is run bureaucratically? I mean, I'm going on too long, but I now have an answer. Remember back when, at the beginning of the Trump administration, when he talked about the scandal at the, for healthcare for veterans at the Veterans Administration. Those doctors were government employees operating by bureaucratic rules, and the victims in that same situation were the veterans. So those, when you have that kind of a situation where the people who are giving the treatment can't be fired, and the people who are getting the treatment can't go anywhere else, you have a predictable outcome, just like you had in the VA, which Trump corrected, and just like you have today in England. Now, when I was last in England, they still had free, they had an open market in real doctors outside of that bureaucratic system. So when I was there, I sought treatment, from a doctor that I was privileged to hire and pay, as opposed to somebody assigned to me at random.
Yeah. So you're talking about complete government takeover of healthcare.
That's what it'll be.
Which you're saying there should have been some an 11th amendment in the Bill of Rights, freedom of healthcare. What about
government stays out of healthcare, just like it stays out of religion, stays out of the press.
What would they say though about the government simply helping out the poor when it comes to healthcare? So the government is going to provide free healthcare to the poor.
There was nothing like the welfare state then, but the poor were always taken care of in colonial America and in the early days. They had homes for these people and things like that.
But wasn't it private charity primarily that was providing for that? Or was it actually the government?
It's mostly private charity, but there were government poorhouses, and which were residences for the poor that were paid for by government. Of course, it was in those days it varied very much from state to state and city to city. So I'm not an expert enough to tell you overall what the percentages were. And
probably nothing from the federal government. It would all been local.
Oh yeah. Oh, definitely. And the founders intended for the federal government to be concerned with America's relations with states around the world and the economic relations among the American states. So the original cabinet, was war and Navy, Treasury, and state. That was it. Because the idea was that the United States, the states were to come together and unite, and the federal government would deal collectively with the world and also coordinate the economic, keep open the free markets in the states. So there really wasn't the founders never dreamed of a Department of Health and Human Services or housing and urban development or any of that kind of stuff.
And it was individual freedom was their focus.
Liberty.
Right?
They called it liberty
of the individual, and recognize that everyone is free to choose their course in life
Right.
make their own decisions,
Right.
go out and live their life as they choose, as a free
Right.
individual, free thinking individual. So,
Absolutely.
so you're in agreement with that? Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
how would the founder? What would the founders say about the way we're treating COVID? And we are putting aside the example I gave, but just speaking more generally about the idea that we're not being allowed to make our individual choice as to how much risk to put ourselves through. I mean, theoretically, there could be no rules regarding COVID, and everyone makes their own decision as to whether to leave the house, whether to wear a mask, whether to go to a restaurant, whether to go to a sporting event. And if you're afraid to do those things, or you're in a high risk category, you would choose to be much more cautious and perhaps stay home. And people who are in low risk or don't mind taking the risk would go out, and everybody would individually decide what to do. So that's the alternative to what we're doing. What would the founders say about all this?
Yeah, but they would assume that they wouldn't even think about it. I mean, they did it in Sweden, by the way, and it's worked out great. This, I was recently in the hill country of Texas for a week, and the people there weren't wearing masks. Now, the employees who had to wear masks were wearing them. So my wife and I talked to the Texans about why they didn't wear masks, and they said, "Well, this is the word sheep was mentioned often." And really, everybody we talked to had the same thing. This is theatrical, and its meaning is conditioning people to be more and more accepting of being pushed around by the government. And I think that's absolutely true. There's no, this is some kind of strange political thing. It doesn't have anything to do with health, and that's why we should have our independent ability guaranteed by the Bill of Rights that would protect us from this kind of nonsense. I mean, Dennis Prager wrote, I'm going on too long, all right. Dennis Prager wrote a beautiful thing, and he said that, maybe the 2 weeks made some sense, but since then, this is a crime. We know this is not working. It's failing. This is what's going to happen with this. This is what's going to happen with every virus. Eventually, the whole population of the world is going to be exposed to it and adapt to it. It's a fact.
It's just so stunning how few people articulate this, though. This idea that I just stated, which is, I'm not claiming credit for it, obviously, but just the idea that everybody makes their own individual decision as to how to act in light of COVID. But I'm not hearing anyone, for the most part. You just said Prager. I mean, obviously some conservative commentators and so on.
Right.
But as far as politicians, in office politicians, you don't hear anybody advocating for this. You don't hear Trump. Trump's, really bad in my view, even though the left criticizes him for not doing enough. I think he deserves more critique from the right for doing too much. You've got DeSantis in Florida. At least he seems to be kind of getting what you and I are saying, which is this is individual choice. But gosh, besides DeSantis, I just don't see anyone.
It's a frightening thing. The way the American people have accepted having their rights taken away. I mean, people are being subject to house arrest for living in America. I mean, this is crazy. We've had. It may be that the Hong Kong flu was more deadly. Well, not that long ago, we didn't do any of these things. We left it in the way you described, which is okay. Use your head, make your own decisions, consider your health, consider how confident you are in your immune system, whatever, and go about your business. That's the way we've always handled these things. One, SARS, swine flu, all of them have been handled the same way. This is completely new and completely crazy.
Yeah, I don't think in the history of our country we've ever quarantined healthy people.
It's never been done before. I know a little bit about this, and I've written quite a bit, by the way, about this mistake. I just want to say, kind of in Trump's defense, that when I saw him come out there the very first time, Fauci was by his side. I turned to my wife and said, "Okay, we're in trouble now," because you may not remember, but Fauci was the person who had America believing that we were all at risk just from contact from getting AIDS. So he went before the Congress back in the 80s and said, "I need hundreds of millions of dollars to do research so we can find a vaccine, because everybody's at risk of getting AIDS. We have to have a vaccine, or else we could have the population be devastated by AIDS. Well, he got the hundreds of millions. Still don't have a vaccine for it, and this time it was the brains, if you'll excuse the quote marks around that word, of this response. He's a guy who should have been. When he testified before Congress, I knew better, and I believed then that he knew better, that what he was saying wasn't true. Now it's possible he was mistaken, but it seems very hard for me to believe it, because the information that he was wrong about AIDS is as clear as the information is that he was wrong about COVID. I think he's run so whether he was mistaken or whether he was lying, he's frightened. The country was frightened. Congress was frightened into giving him, really tens, I think hundreds of millions of dollars even.
Yeah, well, there's this battle going on. Trump gets criticized that he doesn't, trust the scientists. We need to trust the scientists, right? Well, the politician's job is to listen to all sides, and yes, listen to the scientists, but you also have to take into account everything else. So this whole idea that we should just lockstep do what the scientists tell us to do. My doctor tells me not to eat red meat, but I make my own decision, and I say, I eat red meat in moderation. I make my own individual. So I get the advice, and then I decide what to do with that advice. We've fallen into this trap where no, the scientists tell us, the doctors, who are always very conservative inherently, all about protecting your health, we should be doing what they tell us to do, but they're just looking at it from one vantage point. It's fine what they're advising. That's one vantage point. Just like they can advise us that going fast on the freeway is more likely to result in an accident. And then we make the decision where to set the speed limit. So that's what it seems to be missing in this equation. And I would criticize Trump for this, that he's not showing that other side enough. You've got the COVID task force, but what happened to that economic task force that there was going to be? I mean, every time that they come out with with reporting on how we're doing on COVID, I want a report side by side with that on how we're doing with the economy and how we're doing with the unintended consequences, health consequences of the shutdown. That should be on the very next slide.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I wrote on this back at the beginning, I wrote a series of 3 articles. And what I argued for is that, Fauci was shown to be someone not to put your trust in. And that besides, to listen to one doctor is not what we do in our personal life. You seek a second opinion, you seek a third opinion. And so I argued that what we needed was a Team B approach. There's a lot of epidemiologists out there who said exactly what's happened, at the time. And I said that cruise ship was a perfect test. It tells us we don't know anything now that we didn't know from looking at how the people on that cruise ship did. They were locked together. They couldn't get off. Everybody was exposed. Only the old died. Some were sick. More had a rough time. Some weren't so sick. That profile is the profile we have today. So, and there were plenty of epidemiologists pointing to that and to other factors that said, hey, the right thing to do is what you were talking about. The right thing to do is what Sweden did do. And we needed a Team B at the beginning. I actually tried to get some messages to Trump about that, to tell you the truth.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just stunning how state governors have fallen in line for the most part, and internationally that Sweden is the only example. And
it's surprising.
Yeah. It's surprising, right? Who would have guessed Sweden?
I wouldn't have.
But also you also still don't hear that much about Sweden. I mean, Sweden.
No, it's being suppressed.
Talked about, huh?
It's being suppressed, and people still think that the long time New York Times and others said that the Sweden experiment was a nightmare, and so they're not changing their story. They're not coming out and telling how well it worked. Yeah, I think the right thing to say about this is this doesn't have anything to do with with this flu. We've never reacted to a flu like this before. This is a worldwide impulse to tyrannizing over citizens. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it's reflective of the American population today that we have become so accepting of it. The other barometer that I've used is the fact that Bernie Sanders, a devout, open socialist,
Yeah.
got half of the votes from the primary voters in when he ran against Clinton, and also was almost he almost won twice basically. So
Right.
that a large of a swath of Americans believe that socialism is the right direction for America, when that is the antithesis of what the founders would have ever thought of for this country. Maybe you could just touch on that a little bit. How did we get here, and B, kind of explaining why yes, socialism is the opposite of what America was founded on.
It's a great question. It happened on campus about 100 years ago. The progressives came to take over thought in America, and so it got to the point. Bill Ayers, the terrorist. He stopped blowing up police stations, became a professor of education, was very honored, and had a big role. So what's been happening is educators have been being educated by people in anti-Americanism, and the anti-Americans all say socialism is better. So these kids out there who are knocking over statues of Washington, they learned in school that Washington was a bad man, slave owner, and that socialism is better, and so they're just carrying out what they were taught. So it didn't come from nowhere. If you'd be shocked if what's your alma mater? Where'd you go to school?
UC Irvine.
Well, I don't know how up you are on what's going on there, but there's some things going on at UC Irvine that would curl your hair. If you don't know about it, you might want to find out about it, because what's happened is the 60s radicals took over the universities, and then those guys have retired and put even more radical people in. And the things that are being taught at UC Irvine has got some really horrifying things going on, and that's where it came from. So Americans, the young people were victims of a miseducation, and the Americans who are frightened, who are wearing these masks and all into this, they're the victims of a very deceitful press that's frightened them, and so they're disoriented by fear. American people the American people in general are right now disoriented by fear, and the young people are disoriented by what they were taught in school.
So one of the mantras that's used to discredit the founders and the founding documents is the fact that slavery existed at the time. So, and I mean, it's very, very significant to justifying, I think, their movement to discredit.
Yes.
So when the Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal, and you've explained that means everyone, not just males, but females, but you had slaves. So what is the explanation for that?
Well, do you know what about happened in Haiti about the same time, 1791? What happened is that there was an uprising in Haiti, and basically it was a race war, and in the end, all of the white people were killed. Haiti had its revolution. France had his, we had ours. Haiti had theirs, and theirs turned out to be a race war, and all were killed.
That Haiti was a colony of what country?
France.
Of France. So they cast off France and killed all the French.
Killed all the white people on the island. Yeah, and so it was a terrifying thing. At the end, the guy who took over said, all the white people can come forward and be forgiven, and they all came forward, and they killed all of them. So anyway, it's a terrible thing to think about, but there was a real fear of racial animosity, of race war, and so, for example, Jefferson said, "There's nothing that justifies this. The slaves have unalienable rights just as we do. So how do we get out of this situation that's been created, which was created on ideas about property that pre-existed the ideas of the founders? So they inherited a situation where these people were here. They didn't like it, but what to do? To declare everybody's free tomorrow would have a lot of problems. One of them would be these people might not be able to take care of themselves. The people who claim to own them might not be willing to go along with that. I mean, it was a terrible problem. And what happened was the the American founders laid down the marker: all men are created equal, all people are created equal. That marker was fulfilled at great cost in America: 350,000 Indian lives to free the slave. It's the story of incredible, noble sacrifice. So instead of a race war, we had a war between the South and the North that settled that we weren't going to have slaves, and it cost an enormous. It was an incredible body blow to America, and one of the the noblest war ever fought. One of them, surely.
So it was what you're saying is it's those founding principles
Yes,
that permitted the end to slavery.
that's what I was trying to say. Yeah, the founding principles, put the it put an end to slavery. It just took time, like a lot of things do, to work out. Once America was, America was the only country ever founded on the idea that we're created equal. That country wasn't going to continue to be a slaveholding country. It just took a lot to get that worked out. It was a big problem. It was a real, practical, difficult problem. What do you do about this problem? But it was resolved with the Civil War, and at that point, you got the founding complete. You got liberty. You don't have slavery. America. Lincoln's the last of the founders.
Interesting. Well, in today's cancel culture, unless you were absolutely perfect throughout your entire life in all respects, you get canceled out. So if you owned a slave, even though slavery was legal at that time, or if you didn't spill your blood to free the slaves in 1776 or what have you, then you get canceled out. And I'd like to get your comments on cancel culture and what the founders would say. I'd like to give my favorite thing to say about that is that Barack Obama needs to be canceled also because he opposed gay marriage. So, so he needs to be canceled out also. I don't know if there's any statues of Obama or whatever, but he was a homophobe who ran for president and became president opposed to gay marriage.
Well, he'll get a pass because it was a wink-wink opposition, wasn't it? I mean, nobody really took that. That was to get elected. Not. He showed it quite clearly afterwards. Yeah, the whole idea of cancel culture. Yeah, the founders believed that we were going to settle things by common sense. That we are the common sense nation. That people were going to come together with freedom of speech to say what they believe, and in an open market of ideas and beliefs, and that we were going to, respecting each other, come to conclusion about what's the best that we can do in this circumstance. And that's not cancel culture. The founders wouldn't even have understood the idea. You couldn't have made them understand.
Well,
because the key idea is individual liberty.
Yeah, well, it's the height of political correctness, and I think maybe to kind of, as our last thing to cover, we'll help you give people a little bit of an education, because I pulled out some quotes from I think it was an article that you wrote about the issue of equality and what it really meant to the founders and how it's been perverted. So I think it'd be helpful to people. I'm going to read some of this, and then I'll stop for you to comment. But this part's a little bit long, but I think it's really important for people to hear. For the founders, our natural equality and our unalienable rights define each other. The golden coin of liberty has two sides. On one side is our natural equality. On the other side, our unalienable rights. The enemies of American liberty in academia and the media have substituted a counterfeit, now in wide circulation in our nation. This debased coin of the political realm is easy to recognize. On one side is the debased understanding of equality. It claims to legitimize government redistributing property, robbing Peter to give to Paul. Call it the CP side for confiscation of property. So I'll stop there, and then we'll talk about how they've perverted the other side of the coin.
Um, gosh, it's
So well written, isn't it?
it's so well written. I just hardly know what to say. Yeah, I think that the situation is that Americans are no longer trained in the ideas of the founder. They're no longer led by examining its beauty and its wonder and its depth to love the ideas of the founder. And so, and now people don't know what the real coin looks like, and they accept a counterfeit, thinking that they actually are given the real deal. You've got to do two things. You've got to make a population that's ignorant of what that dollar looks like, and then you've got to make it so that they don't care. And so that's the job of the communicators who oppose the American idea, is to get people to accept the counterfeit and think they have the real thing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems I say is that we're doing so damn well that it's easy for people to get complacent and to comply. Because, am I going to go out as upset as I am about these stupid COVID rules? Has my ass been out there marching downtown Los Angeles or whatever? No, because I got a pretty nice house and I got my television set. So, and I got a car that I can go get an Airbnb somewhere. So, I'm coping. So I comply. Right?
You're so right.
That's the problem, is we've been too successful.
Well, I think it's so wonderful that we've been so successful, and it's the idea of freedom brought to economic activity that made us so successful. I really think that you've touched on a problem, but I want to put it just a little bit differently. There's two kinds of people in America: the people who are grateful for all that it has given us and all it does for us, all the opportunity it gives us, and they're the people who manage to be ungrateful. Ingratitude is the basis of socialism, this kind of revolutionary idea that's going on. There's burning, rioting in the streets and knocking over statues and stuff. It's not easy, I think, to convince people who are so privileged to be mad. It takes pretty good propaganda to do that. But in one of my articles I wrote, you don't have to go back very far in your own family to find a time when the people and that ancestor of yours will be simply astonished by the liberty and the affluence of our lives. You don't have to go back very far at all.
But it's not just when you use the term privileged. My point is that I'm obviously not talking about white privilege. I'm just talking about the 99%, 98% of Americans that are doing pretty well. We've got a roof over our heads. We have air conditioning. We have electricity. We have good plumbing. We have a plasma television set on the wall. I mean, that's, excuse the specific, 98, 97, 99, whatever. It's the vast majority of Americans. So when you have everyone doing that well and you take away liberties, it's not surprising that people aren't fighting it. I guess it should not be surprising. I like to act surprised and complain that why are people being so sheepish? But there's only so much I'm doing. Arguably, all of us should be doing more.
Well, it's true. I think that the biggest problem is that people have lost the historical story. They don't realize what a wonderful experiment America is. How much we created the prosperity that's now not like ours, but worldwide. That comes from us too. People are thinking, they're not thinking with any sense of the depth of the history. I was born and raised on a farm where all the work was done by animals. There were no machines and there was no electricity either. And so I'm old and everything, but it wasn't that long ago when a lot of Americans lived like that. And we're so fortunate. All of us are so rich. Even the people on welfare have air conditioning, which Louis XIV didn't have. They have, access to health care that was undreamed of in Louis XIV day. By the way, courtiers used to try to get extra points with Louis by catching, ticks and fleas and stuff off him and crushing them for him. So even Louis XIV lived in a in really what is by our standards, in many ways, extreme privation. We got it pretty good.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go back to the coin and go to the other side.
Okay.
Quoting from Robert Curry again.
Yeah,
On the other side, in place of unalienable rights, are the ever-expanding dictates of political correctness. Call it the PC side. The founders believed that we have a natural and unalienable right to judge for ourselves. Today in America, political correctness increasingly determines which of our thoughts and feelings are forbidden and which are required. Americans who accept this counterfeit without protest do so because they have forgotten or never knew the look and feel of the real thing.
Yeah, I think political correctness is, America's the common sense nation, and the idea was we're going to rule ourselves by common sense. But political correctness is the opposite of common sense. Well, what you're saying, sir, is maybe true, but it's not politically correct. That's kind of the world we're living in now, where what's required by political correctness has replaced your own ability to try to understand for yourself and even to express yourself. So more and more, you're being required to think a certain way, certainly to speak a certain way. I mean, political correctness is you got to wear that mask when you go outside. Political correctness is a social force of tyrannizing over people's unalienable right to think and judge for themselves. Founders are big on that.
It's basically thought police, right?
It's thought police. It's 1984. It's all that kind of stuff. It's you have to, and that's brought back to the cancel culture. If you don't think a certain way, there's already severe consequences. People have lost their jobs. People have been ostracized simply for not agreeing with what's politically correct, even when what they were saying was actually correct.
And last thing to touch on, as far as how the founders would feel about the identity politics, where it's just everything is about what is the person's gender, what is the person's race, what is their sexual orientation, and lumping everybody in based on these categories. What would they say about that?
Unthinkable. I mean, the whole idea was we were going to have a country where everybody, all human beings, had recognized. The founders were going to create a system and a country around the idea that was dedicated to the idea that we have all of us have equal, unalienable rights. So the idea that we'd be divided up by these kind of things never occurred to them. Around the world, that's the way it was. There was the king, and there were the aristocrats, and the aristocrats at various levels. Dukes outranked counts, and so on. And what you were as you were born determined everything about your life. In America, the idea was, we're still working towards it in many ways, but we're doing a pretty good job. The idea was you, individual, are free and equal, and go out there and achieve what you can, have the life that you choose for yourself. That's an idea. When people come here from abroad, that's what they say. I came here because I want to create my own life. I don't want to live the life that was laid out for me because of where I was born, or who my father was, or what town it was in,
it's almost as if it's recent immigrants these days that we almost have to rely upon. They're the ones that tend to have the genuine appreciation for America.
I know some. These are not illegal immigrants, but they're people who came here. One of my friends, Peter Schramm, he was from Hungary, and his father said, "We're Americans. We just happen to be born in Hungary, and when we can, we're going to America." And Peter. I love Peter. One of the reasons I love him is because he loved America, and I did too.
Yeah, America is supposed to be a concept, but people have forgotten the concept.
It's been beaten out of them. When kids go to school that I know, I say, look, they're going to try to beat the common sense out of you. They're going to try to teach you not to love America. Don't let them.